With few exceptions, developing countries, especially the least developed countries, are or were for a long time ruled by dictatorships or poorly consolidated democratic regimes, under the command of elites in general indifferent to the social welfare of the rest of the population. The government failed to fulfill many of its elemental attributions and is dedicated to satisfying the interests of the family, the social class, or the ethnic group that holds power. The appropriation of the state apparatus by a sector of society is more common in less developed countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and is called the predatory state by the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells. In extreme cases, one person manages an entire country. In developing countries that have reached a certain degree of industrialization, like many emerging ones, it is common for a social group or political party to appropriate the state's apparatus. In this case, different types of favoring tend to occur, such as the granting of subsidies and tax incentives to economic groups linked to the established power, often to the detriment of social investments that could benefit the majority of the population. The diversion of government functions, the licentious relationship between the state and capital, the government and the political party, the impunity of dishonest public officials, and the disrespect for citizenship ended up intensifying corruption, a serious problem in developing countries. Although not exclusive to these countries, corruption in the public sector is strongly rooted in most of them, due to the lack of government transparency, the fragility of the legal system, and impunity, and consumes huge resources that could be invested in solving social problems. Transparency International created the Corruption Perceptions Index, in which countries are ranked according to the degree of perceived corruption in the public sector, ranging from 0, highly corrupt, to 100, highly honest. Another serious problem that many of the less developed nations face, especially African and Asian ones, are wars, most of them civil, which ruin them socially and economically. These wars mainly affected countries that the Fund for Peace calls fragile states. This concept defines the nations in which the state has such a degree of disruption that their society is very vulnerable to violent conflicts and social and economic disintegration. It indicates that the state is unable to fulfill its mission of guaranteeing peace, security, and social cohesion to the inhabitants of its territory. It is measured by the State Fragility Index, which is made up of 12 social, economic, political, and military indicators. In the last report, Yemen was the most vulnerable state and Finland the most sustainable. There is also a strong correlation between the Corruption Perceptions Index and State Fragility Index. When there is widespread corruption, society becomes more unstructured, and therefore there is a greater vulnerability and higher state fragility. At the other extreme, when there is a lower rate of corruption, there are more cohesive and stable societies, more sustainable states, and lower state fragility. These indicators also strongly correlate with the Human Development Index. The poorest countries, despite having a small GDP, spend proportionately more on weapons, leaving less for social investments. It is also important to remember that the less developed countries do not produce weapons, so they import from developed countries and some emerging ones, mainly from large military powers. In many less developed countries, and with serious institutional problems, the lack of socio-economic perspectives leads many to armed groups. To overcome the lack of socio-economic prospects and discouragement in poor countries, the vicious circle of poverty must be broken, especially in the so-called fragile states. However, this is a challenging task.